It was a warm summer afternoon when Clara knocked on my door, her soft smile framed by wisps of silver hair that had slipped loose from her bun. Her eyes, though older, were still bright, carrying the kind of warmth that comes from years of kindness. Clara had lived next door to me for as long as I could remember, and over the years, we'd developed a friendly relationship, exchanging pleasantries and small talk whenever we saw each other. But today was different. There was something in her expression, something that hinted at more than the usual neighborly request. Her hand lingered on the doorframe, and for a moment, I could see a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Andrew," she began softly, "I was wondering if you could help me with something." Her words were gentle, but there was an unfamiliar tension in the air. I glanced down at the garden glove still in my hand, soil clinging to my fingers from the weeds I had been pulling in the backyard. "Of course," I replied, trying to sound casual. "What do you need?" Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "It's a bit embarrassing," she admitted, her eyes darting to the side. "But there's something in my attic that I can't move on my own. Would you mind giving me a hand?" The request seemed simple enough, but there was something in the way she asked that made me pause. Clara had always been independent, rarely asking for help. But seeing her now, her vulnerability softened me. "I'd be happy to help," I said, nodding. "Just give me a minute to clean up, and I'll come over." She smiled gratefully, her eyes lingering on mine for a second longer than usual before she nodded and turned to walk back to her house. As I washed the dirt from my hands and changed into a fresh shirt, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this. My neighbor, whom I'd always seen as the sweet older lady next door, seemed anxious. There was a weight in the air that I couldn't quite place, but I dismissed it, telling myself I was overthinking things. A few minutes later, I was standing at her door, the screen creaking open as she welcomed me inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender, just like it always did, a comforting scent that had come to feel familiar. "Thank you again," Clara said as she led me up the stairs. "I know it's not much, but I've been meaning to move a few boxes around, and I could really use the help." "It's no trouble at all," I assured her, following her through the narrow hallway that led to the attic stairs. As we climbed the wooden steps, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the house was. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the small space, and when we reached the attic, I found myself glancing around at the dusty boxes and old furniture that had been stored away for years. "What exactly do you need help with?" I asked, surveying the room. Clara walked over to a stack of boxes in the corner, her hand resting on one as she turned to face me. "Just these," she said, her voice soft. "They're heavier than they look." I nodded, moving closer to help, but as I reached for the first box, I felt her presence beside me, closer than I'd expected. I paused, glancing at her, and saw the way her gaze had softened. The light filtering through the small attic window caught the strands of her silver hair, and for the first time, I noticed the way her lips parted slightly as she looked at me. "Andrew," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." I froze, my hand still on the box as I turned to face her fully. "What is it, Clara?" I asked, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. There was something in the way she was looking at me, something I couldn't quite read. She hesitated, biting her lip before taking a small step closer. "It's complicated," she began, her hand brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I couldn't deny the strange, unfamiliar tension that seemed to have settled between us. I swallowed hard, trying to focus on her words, but all I could think about was the way her fingers had lingered on my skin for just a second too long. "Clara, what's going on?" I asked, my voice a little unsteady. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought she might step back, but instead, she took another small step closer, her hand now resting gently on my arm. "I don't want to make things awkward between us," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. "But I've been feeling something I can't ignore." My mind raced, trying to process what she was saying, but I couldn't think clearly. All I could feel was the warmth of her touch, the way her eyes seemed to hold mine, and the unmistakable tension in the air. "Clara," I began, but the words died on my lips as she took another step forward, closing the distance between us. Her hand slid down my arm, and before I could react, she was standing right in front of me, her breath warm against my skin. "I know this is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I can't help it. I've felt it for a while now, and I think you have too." My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew I should say something, anything, to stop this from going any further. But I couldn't. Instead, I found myself frozen in place, caught in the pull of her gaze, the softness of her touch. "I don't know what you mean," I said quietly, though the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. The truth was, I didn't know. I had felt it too, the strange, unspoken connection between us, the way her presence made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. But I had pushed it aside, telling myself it was just my imagination, that it was wrong. Clara's hand moved to my chest, her fingers tracing a line across my shirt, and I felt my resolve slipping away. "Don't lie to me, Andrew," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "I've seen the way you look at me." My breath caught in my throat as her words hung in the air between us. There was no denying it now, no pretending that this was just a neighborly interaction. The tension had been building for months, slowly, subtly, and now it had reached a point where there was no turning back. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. For the feelings I had tried to deny? For the fact that I couldn't stop myself from wanting her, despite everything? Or for the fact that I knew, deep down, that we were about to cross a line that could never be undone? Clara smiled softly, her hand still resting on my chest. "Don't be sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not." Before I could respond, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was so soft, so tentative, that it sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment I didn't move, too shocked by what was happening to react. But then, as if a dam had broken inside me, I kissed her back, my hands finding their way to her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, and with it, the tension that had been simmering between us for so long finally exploded into something undeniable, something raw and real. My hands slid up her back, and I felt her shiver beneath my touch. The attic, the boxes, the whole world seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us, lost in each other. But as quickly as it had begun, I pulled away, my breath ragged as I stared at her. "Clara, we shouldn't." "I know," she whispered, her forehead resting against mine. "But I don't care." Neither did I. For the next hour, time seemed to stand still. We moved together in a slow, intimate dance, our touches soft, hesitant, but filled with a desire that neither of us could deny. Every glance, every whispered word, felt like a secret shared only between us, something forbidden but too powerful to resist. And when we finally crossed that line, when we gave in to the emotions and the desire that had been building for so long, it was with a sense of inevitability. There was no stopping it, no going back. We were too far gone. Afterward, we lay there in the quiet attic, our breathing slowing as the weight of what we had done settled over us. I could feel Clara's hand resting on my chest, her fingers tracing lazy circles on my skin, but the warmth that had filled the room was quickly replaced by a heavy silence. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Clara didn't answer right away. She shifted beside me, her eyes distant as she stared at the ceiling. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice quiet, almost resigned. "I don't know what comes next." Neither did I. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in the aftermath of something we couldn't undo, something we couldn't explain. The guilt and the confusion were already starting to creep in, but there was still something else, a lingering connection that neither of us could deny. "I should go," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I had to. Clara nodded, her eyes still distant. "Yes," she said softly. "You should." I dressed in silence, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. and when I finally left the attic, left her house, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As I walked back to my own house, the weight of what had happened settled over me, but the questions still lingered, unanswered. What had we done? What would happen next? I didn't know. But the one thing I did know was that the tension between us, the connection, the desire, was far from over. Days passed, and the weight of that afternoon never left me. Every time I saw Clara in the garden, watering her plants or carrying groceries inside, I felt an electric charge rush through me, reminding me of what we'd shared. I found myself avoiding her more than I cared to admit, but I knew that eventually, we would have to confront the reality of what had happened. One evening, I sat by the window, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was a brilliant mix of oranges and pinks, the kind of sunset that should bring peace, but instead, it left me restless. I couldn't stop thinking about her, the way her eyes had locked onto mine, the softness of her lips, and the way we'd given in to something we both knew was wrong but couldn't resist. I heard a knock at the door, and for a moment my heart stopped. I knew it was her before I even opened it. There she stood, wearing a soft, flowing dress that swayed gently in the evening breeze. Her eyes met mine, and the familiar tension crackled between us, the unspoken weight of what had passed, and what still lingered, hanging heavy in the air. "Can we talk?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. We stood in the living room, the silence between us almost unbearable. I could feel my heart racing, and I wondered if she could hear it. Clara looked down at her hands, fidgeting slightly, something I'd never seen her do before. She had always been so composed, so sure of herself. But now, she seemed as lost as I felt. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about that day," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I know we shouldn't have done it, but I don't regret it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been wrestling with my own guilt, but hearing her say she didn't regret it brought everything into sharper focus. Did I regret it? The truth was, I wasn't sure. Part of me wanted to push it all away, to pretend like it never happened. But another part of me, the part that had been drawn to her in the first place, couldn't stop wanting more. "Neither do I," I confessed, my voice quieter than I'd intended. "But I don't know what this means for us." Clara took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch mine. The moment her fingers brushed against my skin, a familiar warmth spread through me, and I had to remind myself to breathe. "I don't either," she admitted, her eyes searching mine. "But I don't want to pretend that what we feel isn't real." I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. "But Clara, this is complicated. We can't just ignore the fact that there are consequences. What if someone finds out? What if—" Her fingers pressed lightly against my lips, silencing me. "I know," she whispered, her eyes softening. "I've thought about all of that, believe me. But I also know that life is too short to ignore something that feels right." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Could this possibly be right? I didn't have an answer, but as I looked into her eyes, I felt something deep inside me shift. I didn't want to let this go. Without thinking, I pulled her into my arms, my hands finding the familiar curve of her waist. Her breath hitched as our bodies pressed together, and before I could stop myself, I kissed her. It was slow, tentative, but filled with a longing that had been simmering beneath the surface since that day in the attic. Clara responded with equal intensity, her arms wrapping around my neck as she kissed me back. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. We were both fully aware of the line we had crossed, but neither of us cared anymore. We spent the next few hours wrapped in each other, the world outside forgotten as we gave into the emotions that had been building for so long. Every touch, every kiss felt more intense, more desperate, as if we were trying to make up for lost time. But as the night wore on and the initial rush of passion began to fade, reality crept back in. We lay together on the couch, her head resting on my chest, the steady rhythm of her breathing a soothing counterpoint to the chaos in my mind. I could feel her warmth against me, her fingers tracing lazy circles on my skin, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect. But then the guilt returned, sharper and more painful than before. What were we doing? This wasn't just a fling, wasn't something that could be brushed aside. Clara wasn't just some woman I'd met in passing, she was my neighbor, a woman I'd known for years. And she was older, much older than me. The age difference loomed large in my mind, a constant reminder of how complicated this had become. We can't keep doing this, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Clara shifted, her eyes meeting mine in the dim light. I know, she said softly, her fingers stilling on my chest. But what do we do? I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to navigate the feelings I had for her, the pull between us that seemed to defy reason. All I knew was that I couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal, that we hadn't crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We need to figure out what this means, I said, my voice trembling with uncertainty. Because I don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to ruin whatever this is. Clara nodded, her expression somber. I don't want that either, she whispered. But I also don't want to let you go. The vulnerability in her voice broke something inside me. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her, of walking away from something that felt so real, so intense. But I also knew that we couldn't keep hiding from the consequences of what we'd done. We'll figure it out, I promised, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. We'll take it one step at a time. Clara smiled softly, her hand cupping my cheek. I trust you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Whatever happens, I trust you. Her words sent a surge of warmth through me, and for the first time since this whole thing had started, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could find a way to make this work. Maybe there was a future for us, even if it wasn't clear yet. But as Clara rested her head against my chest once more, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt that lingered in the back of my mind. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead was anything but clear. But for now, we had each other, and that was enough. As I held her close, the weight of the moment settled over me. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. But whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure: my life would never be the same again. And neither would hers. The days that followed were marked by a strange mix of normalcy and tension. Clara and I did our best to go about our lives as though nothing had changed, but every glance, every brief touch, carried the weight of everything we had shared. There were moments when it felt like we were on the edge of something new, something neither of us could define, and other times when the reality of what we had done felt like a heavy cloud hanging over us. I saw her less often in the garden, though I knew she was home. Part of me wondered if she was doing the same as I was, trying to create distance, trying to figure out what came next. But every time I saw her, that familiar pull was still there, a quiet reminder that this was far from over. One evening, about a week after that night on my couch, I found myself sitting on my front porch, the sun setting behind the trees in a brilliant display of orange and pink. It was quiet, peaceful, but my mind was anything but calm. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about us. The guilt that had gnawed at me after we'd first crossed the line had started to blur with something else, something deeper. A connection that felt real, even though everything about it was wrong. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. My heart skipped a beat, and when I looked up, there she was. Clara stood at the edge of my porch, her hands clasped together nervously in front of her. The evening light bathed her in a soft glow, and for a moment, all I could do was stare, caught once again by how beautiful she was, even in her quiet simplicity. "Can I sit with you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, shifting slightly to make room for her on the bench beside me. She sat down, leaving a small but noticeable distance between us. We both stared out at the horizon, either of us speaking for a long moment. The silence was thick, filled with the weight of all the unspoken things between us. "I've been thinking a lot," Clara finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, tentative, and I could hear the uncertainty in her words. "About us?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. "Yes. About what we did, and what it means. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had been thinking about it too, constantly. I have too, I admitted. I'm still not sure what to do. Clara turned to face me, her eyes filled with the same mixture of guilt and longing that had been haunting me for days. I don't want to lose you, she said quietly. But I also don't want to make things harder for either of us. Her words hit me hard, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. I didn't want to lose her either, but I knew that what we were doing was complicated. More than complicated, it was dangerous, emotionally and socially. And yet, the idea of walking away from her felt like a physical pain. We can't keep pretending like nothing happened, I said, my voice rough with the weight of the truth. But I don't know how to move forward either. Clara's hand moved to rest on mine, her touch warm and familiar. Maybe we don't need to figure everything out right now, she said softly. Maybe we can just see where this takes us. I wanted to believe her, wanted to let myself fall into the comfort of that idea. But the reality was harder to ignore. There was no simple path forward, no easy way to navigate the feelings that had grown between us. What about the rest of the world? I asked, my voice tight. What if someone finds out? What will people think? Clara's hand tightened around mine, her gaze steady. We've spent too much time worrying about what other people think, she said, her voice stronger now. Maybe it's time we think about what we want. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was a bold statement, one that sent a surge of warmth through me. Could we really live like that, free from the judgment of others, focusing only on what made us happy? It seemed impossible, but at the same time, the thought of it stirred something deep inside me. I don't want to hurt you, I said quietly. Or myself. Clara's eyes softened, and she leaned in closer, her hands still resting on mine. I know, she whispered. But I think we're already past the point where we can avoid that. We've crossed the line, Andrew. We can't pretend it didn't happen. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. She was right. We had already crossed that line, and there was no going back. The question was, where did we go from here? Without thinking, I turned toward her, my hand moving to cup her face. She closed her eyes at the touch, leaning into it, and I felt the familiar warmth spread through me. The connection between us, the one I had been trying to deny, was still there, as strong as ever. Before I could stop myself, I kissed her. It wasn't the tentative, hesitant kiss we had shared before. This was deeper, more urgent, filled with all the emotions we had been holding back. Clara kissed me back with equal intensity, her hands sliding up my arms, pulling me closer. The rest of the world faded away, leaving only the two of us, wrapped in each other. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathing hard, I saw the same conflict in her eyes that I felt in my own heart. We had gone too far to turn back now, but the path ahead was still uncertain. What do we do now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara smiled softly, her hand resting on my chest, feeling the rapid beat of my heart. We take it one day at a time, she said quietly. And we don't look back. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't even a solution at all. But in that moment, it felt like enough. We sat together on the porch as the sky darkened, wrapped in the silence of the evening and the warmth of each other's presence. The future was uncertain, and I knew there would be challenges ahead, difficult conversations, complicated emotions, and the inevitable judgments of others. But for now, all I could focus on was the woman sitting beside me, the connection we shared, and the unspoken promise that whatever came next, we would face it together. The days stretched into weeks, and we found a quiet rhythm in the uncertainty. There were moments of intense emotion, nights when we lost ourselves in each other, forgetting the world outside. And there were moments of doubt, when the reality of what we were doing felt too heavy to bear. But through it all, the connection between us remained, undeniable and impossible to ignore. As the weeks turned into months, I began to wonder what the future would really hold for us. Could we continue like this forever, caught in the space between desire and fear? Would the weight of our secret eventually become too much to bear? I didn't have the answers, and neither did Clara. But as we sat together on her porch one evening, watching the sun set over the trees, I felt a strange sense of peace. Maybe we didn't need to know what came next. Maybe, for now, it was enough to simply be with each other, to hold on to the connection we had found, and to let the rest of the world fade away. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: Clara had changed my life in ways I never could have expected. And no matter where the path ahead led, I was grateful for every moment we had shared.